Well, welcome everyone. My name is Matt Casey. I'm the Associate Director of Graduate Career Services here at Tufts. And on behalf of our team, I'd like to welcome you to our skill-based presentation on CVs. This is a conversation about what CVs are, how they work, what the applications are, what modern trends, how things are evolving, and maybe some best practices. And at the end of this conversation, we can certainly have a discussion about particular questions and showcase some examples. So before we get into more of the details, one thing I always share during these presentations is just making sure everyone realizes that career planning is a process. For those of you who have been here and have been part of other presentations, career presentations here at Tufts, or for those of you who have not, we like to think of career planning is very much a process, and that everyone falls somewhere along this continuum. Sometimes you fall in multiple places on this continuum if you have one job but you're looking for another. But the idea is everybody falls under a place, and the Career Services Department is here to meet you wherever you're at. So if you know exactly what you want and you're getting interviews and you want preparation, we can help with strategy with that. We can help you build your networks. We can help you build your marketing documents like we're talking about today. But if you're not sure what you want, we can help you think about yourself and the market opportunities and how to figure out what your targets are going to be. So we hope that however you might want to use our services, whether or not it's through our recordings, whether or not it's through one-on-one conversations, this is where we can help you in all these areas and more. So today is about marketing tool development. So let's get into it. So resume and CVs. So we're talking about CVs today. So the idea is that I think, maybe this is not necessarily speaking for everybody, is maybe you feel this way about building your CV. I know that I have, and having done this for several years in my career, one thing we want to make sure when you're thinking about your CV is two things. One is building a CV is hard. It is hard to be objective about our own skills and interests and our own brand. Two, writing a resume, like building any other documents or writing in general, is very much a skill. We don't expect our graduate students to be experts in CV design and development. What we want you to be is experts on the content of your experience, and we can help you think about the appropriate format. We can help you think about where it goes, what it looks like, what kind of content should be in it, so you are ideally positioned for the roles that you're looking for. So we are hopefully going to take some of the fear and anxiety out of this process and to give you an idea of how to actually make it a little bit easier to construct them, so you are the desired candidate for the jobs that you seek. Your resume/CV is the most important document you will ever own. This is a quote by Martin Yate, who has, I believe it still is, one of the most successful resume and CV development books in the world. So I tend to agree with this statement from a professional standpoint. The caveat to this statement, and I think it's important, is the LinkedIn profile is becoming almost as important as this document, where your marketing documents like your CV are static. That's something you can post somewhere or you can send. Your LinkedIn profile can be a little bit more personal. It can have a little more content. It can be a little bit more dynamic. It can have more tools and links and represented samples of work. So just keep in mind, as we're thinking about your personal brand and your documents, we're not speaking directly to LinkedIn profile today, but just knowing that we also think, should you want to use it, it's a good tool to build your brand and be reachable by recruiters and hiring managers. So what is a CV? So a CV it describes an individual's education and experience and accomplishments. And it highlights academic related qualifications. So it's usually exhaustive. Usually there's a lot of content. It's oftentimes very biographical, where you're looking at, and we'll compare resumes and CVs in just a minute, is that, length is determined by the nature of your academic and your research and other experiences. So it also includes professional development activities, contributions in your field, and we'll go through a litany of things that you can find in your CV. And it's, like I mentioned before, it's typically longer than a resume, where you might see a resume as maybe 1 to 2 pages, sometimes 3. A CV can be a number of pages. In fact, as an executive recruiter several years ago, hiring for academic leadership positions, at one time received a CV that was 99 pages, which is very prolific from a work standpoint. But the challenge is that no one is typically reading a 99-page CV. So we're trying to create documents that are content rich and meet the expectations of the reader, but also are curated in a way that is easy to navigate that information. Because even though a CV can be more biographical than a resume, it is not just a biography. So we'll go into some of the reasons why that's not true. So when do you need it? So I think the typical way of thinking about it is that I want to be, faculty positions or fellowship or leadership positions within a higher education system. It is very common in clinical positions across a number of healthcare, life science, and biotech institutions, although that's evolving considerably. Research roles, nonprofits, for-profits, think tanks, government, that can be helpful. Although government does typically have its own protocols for documents that are submitted for opportunities. Consulting opportunities have this. Conference proposals, particularly if you're talking about presentations and posters and showcasing thought leadership to audiences. And awards and scholarship applications, which many of you may have already, many of you have been part of one or all of these historically. So there's a number of ways where a CV in a traditional sense is thought about. This slide presentation will be available to everybody at the end of this call or in the coming days. So a lot of this content will be available, so you can go through in detail, but the next two slides are doing a little bit of a comparison about what the different, when we're speaking about a resume and an academic and clinical CV, what the intent of these things are. So your resume is more of a snapshot, it's a balance sheet. It's highlighting skills and expertise and experience that's directly related to the role. It can have a variety of options to it, but it's typically for professional roles, where an academic CV tends to be longer, but as you'll notice, and we'll go through examples, I think that's becoming less and less true. The audience, as we mentioned, could be variable. The applicability, again, academic and clinical opportunities and research and consulting roles, where the resume is oftentimes for nonprofit or industry opportunities. Again, exhaustive from a content perspective. So I think the variation, and I think I just want to call out on this slide, is where the emphasis is. So how should I talk about my previous experience? Where the resume is typically about accomplishment and outcomes and relevance to the role, whereas the CV is can be a lot about volume and showcasing, areas of specialization and consistent specialization in a variety of areas to showcase your expertise in a certain area. Again, length is variable, but what we're seeing more so now, and as you'll see later on in this conversation, is a universe where the resume and the CV are becoming hybrids. Is that because so much of this overlap, and because professionals, even in the academic setting, are looking for outcome-driven pieces, they're shaping the narrative of a CV where there's oftentimes, and for many of you in this conversation, the word resume and CV can be used interchangeably. But I'll speak to a lot about the academic and clinical and consulting and academic sides of this for this conversation. I like to do is references are typically not put on resumes unless specifically asked for in a position description. Usually they'll be asked for if they desire your candidacy and want to evaluate, they want to learn more about you. If have them and be able to present them when asked, where in the academic CV, I think there's an understanding that it's added. I don't necessarily think you always have to do that though. So what are the qualities of best CVs? They are interesting. They tell a story and create interest in 10 seconds or less. Your CV is a marketing document. It is an advertisement. So the idea is that we want to make sure, so when somebody picks up your document, how quickly will they discern what that document's about And then why, when they make that, that understanding, have a clarity quickly of why you are valuable and why you're interesting and why they might want to have a conversation with you. I think the best CVs oftentimes have a title. I'm going to show an example of that a little bit later. The idea is that having information at the top of the page to tell the reader what that document is about. So the idea is when you have all this information and you have a lengthy CV, even if they're expecting the document, what we're trying to avoid is having somebody look at a document, draw a conclusion, but draw the inappropriate one. So we want to help people do is draw the conclusion for the reader, create context for them, and the bulk of that document backs up that information. The best CVs are accurate. So eliminating typos, mistakes, and incorrect information. Don't lie on your resume. There's some flexibility in marketing and branding language, but outright lying are not truth telling, especially if we can spot check that. And that's something in a lot of ways that's not hard to do. You don't necessarily have to write your phrasing on a CV in complete sentences. So if there are times when writing fragments of a sentence are okay. So just understanding it doesn't always have to adhere to strict grammatical rules. But one example was misspelling a company's name or misspelling a piece of information or just a typo. So one of the things of best practices is making sure that you are not the only one who looks at your resume. And it's not just your peers who understand your background, having other people who don't necessarily know your specific background, who have maybe an editorial eye for changes. That can be very useful, because what ends up happening is that quick identification of typos can oftentimes take your candidacy from the yes to the maybe and no pile. And we're trying to avoid that. They are accessible. Your resume, your CV is a static document that's maybe something you send through email, but it's something that you can upload to a job board. It is something you can put on Handshake. It is something you can put in LinkedIn in certain circumstances. It is something that you could add to a career page on a association website. So the idea is what we want to make sure from a career perspective is that it should be easy to find you wherever you are, and not just actively having people that can passively search for you, that can look for your information without you knowing it. That saves you time and energy as you're thinking about your career opportunities, and making sure that when they find you, that it's clear to them why you're valuable, why you're interesting, and why you should have a conversation. And finally, they're relevant. So the idea is they are tailored to the roles. Even your CVs is that they have keywords that are searchable and topics and relevant words that are associated with the position. Is that you might be seeking a clinical role within a healthcare system, for instance, maybe a research role or a fellowship. There may be vocabulary within the position description that showcases your knowledge not only of specific areas of expertise within a discipline, but maybe your understanding of the healthcare landscape in which they're in. So we'll show some tools a little bit later in this presentation of how to think about keywords and how you might identify them and put them into the document. Because oftentimes you're going to be submitting your applications through online application track of job boards, or doing it through a company website. And those company websites use applicant tracking systems. That's the technology that filters your document based on a set of criteria that eventually gets to a hiring manager to evaluate you. So machine learning and AI typically is in the backbone. So making sure you're flagging things that are going to be captured by that technology is helpful. So that is how long you have between when a hiring manager or recruiter or a recruiting board for an academic position or hiring committee. That's how long you have between when they pick up that document and have a first impression and decide whether or not to keep reading or put it in the maybe or the no pile. It's about 6 seconds. That may seem intimidating, but we want people to think, we think that's an incredible opportunity. Because if you understand the behavior of recruiters and hiring managers and how they look at documents, you can customize them to those audiences. So instead of them reading in a traditional format, the way they expect to see information, you're creating the way where they're reading it the way you want them to read it. And there are a number of templates and frameworks that we can share with you after this presentation about how that can be done. And there's no singular way to do it. There's plenty of options. There's plenty of framing that can go into making this work. So you have some, if not a fair amount of flexibility in the design of that document, and a design and aesthetic that is maybe palatable or interesting to the audience, but also something that you like looking at. So I mentioned before that your CV is a marketing and branding document showcasing skills and expertise and potential. It is designed to get you a conversation or an interview. It has 4 pieces. There's the format. The format is how it looks. It's the aesthetic of that document, font and margins and where information is positioned. There's content, which is what you did. There's messaging, which is how you did it. So one thing is sort of speaking to facts. The other thing is, how have you demonstrated competency? How have you developed a series of skills? How have you thought about what you're doing, why they should care about those things? And the last thing is flow. And flow is how information is allocated on the page that makes sense to the reader. And there's no set way to create these things. You know, where your publications go, where your skills go, or where your education goes. That can depend on the nature of what you're trying to do. So what you're targeting is going to dictate a lot of how your document is constructed. When you are thinking about formatting considerations, as I mentioned, there's no standard format and style, but consistency around formatting is helpful. So using consistent font sizes and types. There is, well, I guess I consider to be 2 types of fonts. There's serif fonts and sans serif fonts. Serif fonts have little tails to the end of letters. Sans serif fonts typically do not. So in a typical fashion, there's no specific guidelines. One tenet for very traditional resumes is a serif font for your name and contact details of the type of your document, and a sans serif font for the rest of the document. That is a very loose guideline. We don't necessarily prescribe to that. I think all one font can be great. It'll depend on your preferences, and again, what the expectations for the reader is. But moving in between font types can get very, very disconcerting, or sort of can create a level of a lack of clarity for the reader. So we want some consistency with that, with how the words look. That being said, how you format those fonts within those pieces is helpful. The idea is that you can bold words or fragments of text. You can put text in italics. You can create a series of bullets. So the idea is you're not beholden to just straight text across the entire document. And the reason you think about that 10-second or 6 to 10-second test, there's going to be pieces of information that may be more important to the reader faster than other pieces. It may all at the end be useful. And we try to make sure that all content that's within a document is valuable to the individual creating it and to the reader. But bolding words or fragments of text to draw the eye to pieces of information within a series of bullets or a description of a job can be really helpful, or putting it in italics. And then I think bullets are a very typical way of delineating outcomes or accomplishments within the work that you've done. Spacing is important. The typical margin range is between 0.5 and 1. That could be your preference, or if there's a set of guidelines. I tend to lead towards 0.75 to 0.5. I think it gives enough room and enough space without feeling a little bit squeezed. But there are there are situations when the expectations are very well spelled out, and that actually be really useful. And the other thing with CVs is that unlike a LinkedIn profile or a bio, we don't use pronouns. So I and we and me and they statements, they're just completely eliminated. So you're not bringing the identifier into a framework, you're getting right into the facts and the descriptions. Now, there are a variety of fonts that are common in these places. I think Times New Roman is a very typical format. It's a little bit older in its context, but it's still effective. Garamond is a famous one. Helvetica is one that people tend to like. Avenir is one. Calibri, Cambria. So as you look at different documents, you can start seeing aesthetics and how things are spaced out and how things are allocated depending on what you're trying to showcase. We want to make sure you recognize there is a fair amount of flexibility, even within just a document that's words and lines. So what are typically the main CV components? And that is evolving considerably, as we'll talk about soon. Having your contact details in your, how to be able to reach you, your summary of qualifications. And that's something, depending on, a more modern CV is more common versus just getting into, research experience and education. But showcasing your education, highlighting and talking about your experience and expertise, achievements and activities and skills in the classroom, in the research environments, things that you've done, on campus or off campus, leadership opportunities, community engagement opportunities. There's dozens of things you can highlight within a CV framework. And I mentioned references oftentimes for clinical and academic are asked for, but I do think that is changing. And I think adding references when asked for, I think is how things are going to evolve. So if we are talking about the beginning of the document, the first thing that the organization that is reading your document is going to see is your contact details. Adding your full name is best practice. For those of you who are have an idea, are international or have a unique identifier or go by a certain name, you can add a preferred name or a preferred piece within that. So how you would like to be addressed, and we can certainly show you, best practices of how to do that. If you are applying for opportunities and you have earned credentials, let's say you're applying to a PhD program, let's say you're applying to a research opportunity, adding your academic credentials next to that name can be very appropriate. So adding, you could add a PhD or an MS or a PAC at the end of it, depending on what your personal designation is. So if you've earned the credentials and they're consistent with the role, consider adding them. Oftentimes people ask, should we be adding an address? As the previous slide showed, I think there were 2 different addresses on a CV. I think it is becoming practice. We're taking off the actual location. Specifically, your address is becoming more common practice. So the idea is, if you are adding your street address for your location, you're giving the reader the opportunity to go onto Google Earth, put in your address, and look at your front door. And they may make a biased judgment about something that is inconsequential and unnecessary and inappropriate for the job you're applying for. That being said, regardless of how ethical or moral the decisions are being made, the possibility. My recommendation is, if you're creating these opportunities, if it's not explicitly asked for, is putting the city and state of the closest metropolitan area that you're applying for. So if you're looking for a job in Wellesley, you might consider just putting Boston, Mass. That's an indicator for the reader that you're either there or considering moving to that place. leaving the, and there's a lot of times now they're saying just leaving the address off entirely can be a possibility too. The other thing with the address is that it is a legacy practice based on the fact that 25 years ago, before technology had become ubiquitous and submitting so many applications online, is that you would print out your resume, you would print out your cover letter, you might print out your references and put it in an envelope and mail it to a hiring manager for an organization. That practice is rarely done formally. So the idea of an organization needing to mail you back something, typically that'll happen after they get to know you. Email choices are also something to consider. As a current student at Tufts, I think it is appropriate to use that address for fellowship opportunities, for internship opportunities, for job search opportunities. When you leave Tufts, your affiliation is not necessarily to that brand anymore. I think having a neutral brand around your email address becomes helpful. I think a recommendation is either use a Gmail address with your name if possible, or use creating a vanity or custom email address. So, your name at yourmainName.com. So, and I think there's a number of ways to do that. You can even do it through Gmail. You can buy a name very inexpensively through something like GoDaddy and have it filtered through Gmail. It's not terribly difficult, but Gmail does it. The idea is that your email address could be a flag to employers where ageism could be part of the equation. We are trying to prevent that. So the idea is if you have an AOL address, it might be my parents' email address. If it's a Yahoo address, it might be mine. If you see a Gmail, it could be anybody. So again, we're going to make sure that being consistent so people just get through this very quickly. The other thing that happens is, do you add a 1 before your phone number on a document? I think it's your choice. The 1 is typically not applied to domestic phone numbers, to dial that number. So if you choose to leave it off, that's great. The other thing to think about is what the behavior of somebody who's reading your document is after they've read your document. Consider putting on your LinkedIn custom URL. What I mean that is that putting your LinkedIn custom URL, ideally to your name. From a recruiting standpoint, if we read your CV and we like it, we're likely going to read your cover letter. And this is if you've submitted an application. If we still like you as a candidate, we're most likely going to go to your LinkedIn profile, and after that, we're going to Google you. And that's going to transpire in about less than 5 minutes. So the idea is that because your LinkedIn profile is not your resume or your CV, it is a much more robust document, and they might be going to it anyways. That's a place where you can sort of shape some more of your narrative or add more content or details or dynamic content. But there are other things. If you have a GitHub site or you have a portfolio site, again, this might be the place to put it so they can see it and check you out. So that's a lot of information about the beginning of your document, but there can be a lot of insights gleaned from that piece before they ever get into the content. So we just want to make sure you have an indication of some of those best practices. Most likely, as you're looking for opportunities after graduating or in process of graduating or in your graduate degree programs here at Tufts, is putting your education close to the top. And the idea is that there's no one specific way to highlight those pieces. But one thing I would say is I think education sections should be simplified. And by that, when a recruiter or hiring manager is looking at this, they are trying to discern very quickly where you went to school, where that was, what your dates were or expected dates of graduation, and what your degree was. And that's more of oftentimes going to be just a quick checkbox. The caveat to that, and there are exceptions in places where you put more detail. I think if you've completed a capstone, a final project, or a dissertation, even if it's in progress, putting the title, saying, if capstone or dissertation, and just the title of your document or that presentation. If they want to know more, the audience wants to know more about it, they can ask it. But what it's doing is validating a long-term focused project around your expertise. If you don't have one, that's completely fine. But I think there are, putting things, I think if you have, people ask, should I have my GPA on my education section? I think the idea is that the basic expectation is that if you have a 3.5 or more in your education section for any of your degrees, you can add it. But the thing with that, if you don't, that's fine, because it is assumed that because you have a matriculated student at Tufts, is that you've been vetted by Tufts to be a student here. So there's an expectation as a graduate student is that you're successful in undergrad in some way, and the fact that you are accomplishing great things in your current program. So, but if you graduated magna cum laude or cum laude, I would add that. That's an indicator for those. But I think other things where if it's academic projects or other pieces or research or awards and honors, or I think there are other places to put that. I think having a clean place of information is helpful. So, and when you're graduating, you can put your expected graduation as a date. There may be times where you don't do that. It might be times just putting, a student as of right now, or 2019 to current. Lots of flexibility, but I think simplicity is helpful in this context. So again, just a quick example of what that might look like. And you can bold and play with font sizes for readability based on your own preference or what the audience is looking for. Oftentimes with a CV, everything can get caught in an experience section. And this is true of resumes too, is that everything falls into a chronological model. Now that's a little bit different because there oftentimes are a lot of guidelines for CVs. So where, what information can be in there. But I think if you're just putting general experience as a title, you lose an opportunity to frame the discussion of what the audience should know. So in this particular case, it's showcasing research experience and teaching experience and professional experience. So this research experience, and that could be, it could be within a lab, it could be, as an intern, it could be as your own independent study or work that you've done, but it's demonstrating that, depending on the roles that you're looking for, that this is a topic. But you could say something, if your area of research is topically specific, you could have it based on whatever your subject matter expertise. It could be, art history research experience. It could be mechanical engineering or machine learning research experience. So it doesn't just have to be a general header type. You can customize a header type to put the content that's relevant to what you're looking for in a place where they're going to find it faster. Teaching experience, there's a variety of ways to put that. Many of you are going to have that if you're part of this conversation today. Or if you've been writing fellowships, or if you've actually been a teaching assistant. I think there's a number of ways to put that information in, and there's no one way to do that. Sometimes it's just maybe just listing a course. Sometimes it's explaining in more elaborate detail what you taught and methodologies, tools that you've used. So it's going to depend on your audience about how much content you might create for that. But teaching is often can be a big part of a CV for these types of roles. And then identifying professional experience, where you may have worked before, or you may have interned before, and that thinking about, you can add that topically, where it may, all your experience, you may have three professional experiences that are focused in your area of expertise. You might have additional work experience. You might elaborate on your relevant experience. You might just list your additional professional experience. So if you were a camp counselor 5 years ago, dismissing that as valuable is not necessarily ideal. Is that thinking about, jobs you've had when in a younger life or previous experience, there's a lot of insight, a lot of responsibility can go into these things. So as you're building these types of documents, my suggestion is to make sure you're adding all the content first. It is easier to pare this information down, and you can figure out where it goes after you've added the content. But for this part of the conversation, making sure is that you can segment out this. So you can tailor your section titles and categories by relevance. And you can bold position titles so it's easy to understand what you did. You can, and I think it is showcasing value. It doesn't just necessarily list of facts, but how you did the things you do. Many of you, and this is a sort of example of highlighting research experience, are going to have a lot of it. You may have it in one place, you may have it in multiple places. Oftentimes, if you're, for those of you who are master's students or PhD students, you may have been working on multiple projects as part of a PhD program for several years. Making sure is that you can showcase the context of that work that you've done and making it easily understandable for the reader. And this is important because you're thinking about the fact that there are going to be potentially hiring managers that you may be working for who may have a very clear understanding of your technical expertise or your very specific subject matter expertise. But a lot of times you're going to have recruiters who have a general or a modest understanding of your expertise. Being able to simplify and translate the complexity of what you do to an audience that is less clear about it or less educated around your topic is helpful. So, and I'll show you an example in a minute that might be able to do that, but making it understand, like, either what your research is or what it's, what your relevance is, and especially when you're talking about research or professional experience, thinking about the fact that when there are opportunities to quantify time or outcomes or cost reduction or results, there's going to be research where you've done experiments where you don't get the outcome you're looking for, or you have an experiment that doesn't work. You can quantify the number of experiments that you've done and how many have yielded results, because you recognize, and we can help you as you build your documents, recognize is that when you're looking at this information, if you may have run 10 experiments that didn't work over a period of time, but it doesn't mean you didn't do that work. It doesn't mean there weren't outcomes or understanding from those pieces. We want to make sure that recognizing that, not accomplishing an expected goal doesn't mean you take it out. So I think framing where your research can be a big part of this. I want to call this as a framework of thinking. And again, they're demonstrative. They are not directive in how you should absolutely do this. But for those of you who are working in research roles within an academic center, like the Tufts, is that how do you create a situation where you sort of outline that complexity? Here's an example where I think it's a good framing of information. So this is, a collection of experience over, this is 7 or 8 years. So understanding, you see very clearly who they worked for, where that's located, and where the dates are. One thing I'm a big advocate for is if you're framing your document this way, is somewhere either within who you worked for and what your title was. It could be in that section or a description of the role you're in. I think of somehow getting a description, particularly a one-sentence description of the organization you worked for, can be very helpful, because what it allows the audience to do is say, Boston University Medical Center, who are they? This is a way to say, if you're not familiar with that organization, this is what this organization focused on. And a lot of times you can add more content. Maybe it is a 500-bed, tertiary academic medical center. You can quantify the size of those things. The size of the organization doesn't matter. But what it's doing is it's giving the reader a framework of which you did this work. Then I think breaking down is that a lot of times you're putting the organization and then maybe the department. I'm an advocate of saying my role is, let's say, graduate research specialist. I'm in this department, I'm within this school. And if you potentially, for many of you working labs, is maybe putting the lab name. Depending on what you do, oftentimes you will add advisor. I would think about adding advisor if the brand of that advisor is either someone known specifically to the organization you're applying for, or it is generally understood that this person should be known in that organization. But if not, it might not be. It may be something that the audience doesn't necessarily need to know about. But I would want to call is that the next sentence is an example of, instead of getting into just raw bullets around experience, this could be research, this could be professional, is that you may consider a few sentences about the general nature of your work and what you've been working on. So the idea is that you may have particular projects, but for the audience who may not be specialized, responsible for managing projects that assess the cause of metabolic disorders. So even if you're not an expert in those things, you might have an understanding of what that is, or even look up what those things are. But if the vocabulary is so exclusive as to be limiting, it might prevent you from getting past a gatekeeper who doesn't necessarily understand. But it doesn't mean simplify all of it. It just means making it accessible, and we can help with that. But what I want to call attention to as well is that you may have worked in multiple projects. This is a way to frame, and you may have worked in 10 projects, but not all 10 projects may have been valuable in the work that you've done. Maybe you want to call out 1 or 2. This is a way to say, here's a project, here's the topic of this project, and your bullets are outcomes or descriptions of those pieces. So it's I think this is an example of an elegant way to take a lot of information experience and make it just enough information for somebody to get excited about wanting to have a conversation with you. All of you will have very, very specific situations, but I think it's helpful to have some guideposts. And this is, I think, one that can be helpful. Again, talking, and we'll get into sort of scholarship. There may be there may be general ways you want to describe your scholarship, and I'm going to get into more specific examples in a minute. But you might just illuminate, instead of detailing the work you've done or the research you've done, you might just list it and say, this is what I did, and they can ask you questions about it. So how and when you elaborate on something is going to depend on the nature of what you're targeting and what those expectations are, as I mentioned before. And then teaching experience. Another example where more information and more context about the work that's being done. I think you can see is, you can talk about, what kind of work that you've done. It's not, even if it was just grading papers and talking to students about their courses or tutoring, but that may be true, but there are ways to elaborate on that. If you've had, a couple dozen students in your classes, tell the audience that's going to give some scale. Talk about the subject matter experts you're focusing on. How many hours you spent tutoring, developing those students, what kind of skills that you helped organizations develop, how you helped, maybe how you helped the instructor in those places. So recognizing that not everybody has the same expectations for you as in a teaching or teaching assistantship role, and not everybody does it the same way. So we recognize that everyone's unique in that experience, and maybe it is simple, and maybe just as something as you just list that piece. Very common on academic and clinical CVs are listing honors and awards and scholarships. This is another example where maybe just listing them by the topic and who awarded it and the date could be fine. You get another example where you're describing the nature of the role. Not all awards and scholarships and areas of recognition are always valuable. There may be situations where you've earned awards as a primary school student, that I think if there's unique distinction within that opportunity, I think that's great. Does listing all of your academic scholarships helpful? It really depends. I think you're looking for information that's relevant and connected to what the audience might be looking for. So here's just 2 representative examples. This, for a lot of you, is going to be very common, is that you've done presentations and posters and have written journal articles and other pieces. There's standard practice and notation for these. This is one example of how to frame those pieces. In this particular case, a lot of times you're numbering your presentations, but here's the thing with a CV, you may have 40 presentations. Is the reader on a first look at a document going to look at all 40 presentations? The likelihood is less than always. So you can have, instead of saying just these are my presentations and posters, you could say selected presentations, and you could pick out 2, 4, 5, 6, and you can say between selected presentations, it's not annotated here, and between your list of where you've been cited or what you've published is a representative example of 40 presentations around these 3 topics. So what you can simply contextualize for the audience what information they're getting here, and that they can know to ask about it more. And these are based on traditional grammatical guidelines, and there's a few different methods or methodologies for this, and we can speak to all of those as we're helping you draft these documents. But as you're thinking about what can go in around, press publications, citations, and blogs, you're looking at the blue block in the upper left-hand corner, is books and ebooks and associate, publications in articles and science art and there's a lot of different pieces. So recognizing you may lump them all into one area, you may segment them out based on what you've done. And there, I think in a lot of academic positions, you may break them out into categories. There are going to be situations where you are in the midst of publishing something. It is okay to put the publication and the information you have it, and you can put in progress, or to be published if you know a certain date. So, and you can even delineate publications in progress. So there's again a lot of flexibility in how you construct information. This is very important, I think, is that given the nature of work that's being done, there are tools and techniques and skills that are involved in the work that you may be doing. These are 3 examples of how you might describe some of those skills, where it may be, you may have instrumentation skills, you may have software skills, you may have programming skills, you may have topical skills. And these are typically more, when I think of skills and technicals are more things you can do. We tend to leave out things like soft skills, where organization or detail oriented that are hard to measure. Your skills in technical skills in a framework like that are things you can more measure. So these are 3 different ways of you can lump them all together, you could frame them little pieces and just list what those things are, or you could even break down specifically in those categories. One of the things we're happy seeing more often is let's say you have programming language experience. In this case, you could have programming language and you could have Fortran. You're listing the fact that you know how to do this, you have this skill. But let's say you've been doing it for the past 5 years. You can put parentheses 5 years next to Fortran. And what that's doing is telling the audience how much time you've spent. You don't have to do it this way, but recognizing is that you can contextualize your experience. And that's very true because some of you may be completing graduate degrees and pivoting careers. Something that happened very recently is that you may be studying, was a psychology student that wanted to go into data science. And there's tons of overlap between those 2 disciplines, particularly around technical skills. So the idea is that you may want to illuminate, you may have been programming before you were an undergrad in a certain competency. And if they're hiring for these technical competencies, they may say, we're looking for, 3 to 5 years of experience, doing this work. If you might have 8 years of experience doing that work. So recognizing is that you're not always limited by position descriptions saying how much time you've done something. When you can articulate if you have experience doing that, is showcasing that amount of time. That's just one, it's just one way of framing and thinking is that you can quantify as well as identify. I think certifications and memberships can be critical. This can be, and I don't think it's necessarily limited just to your academic pieces. You may have earned maybe a non-clinician or a CPR certification. Well, that may be a 15-week course in advanced life-saving. That may not be directly related to exactly what you're doing, but it's telling an audience that you spent 15 weeks building a competency and a skill set, life-saving skill set. it's just saying the fact that sort of highlighting some of these of your your memberships, but certainly highlighting the ones of professional organizations that you're in. If you've been credentialed by a certain technical skill, like let's say you've completed a certificate program in a certain software system, this may be a place to illuminate that. So anytime you can have a third party validate your skill set, that can be helpful. And then you could have affiliations and membership or leadership opportunities and roles. So these are just, sort of a way, especially in an academic and clinical setting, these are very common. And there are a number of ways to sort of, identify service, which is often for academic CVs, for academic roles is asked for often. But it could be, this case could just be a long list of how you've advised. It could be mentorship, it could be editorial work, it could be promotion, it could be advising, it could be support member, it could be, creator. So recognizing is that organizations definitely hire for value creation skills and competencies, but organizations also hire people. They want to try to hire people that are going to fit into organizations. So recognizing it doesn't just have to be exclusively focused on your work or your research or your academic experience. Potentially your whole life can be or could be resourced in ways, if it showcases value, into a document like this. This is just an example of the types of other information or these of headers and topics. So you can start seeing is that you can have a very robust document around all of these pieces. Some of these can be integrated together, but just experience and research and teaching doesn't necessarily have to be. I think contextualizing your experience and all the work that you've done is very helpful as a filter for readers. And I thought, I recognized one thing very recently is working with a graduate student is a graduate that had a patent and something I hadn't seen before at doing work like this. So yeah, if you've been recognized for something in that vein, or that's something you can put in. Again, for your own evaluation and review after this presentation today, again, more examples of what kind of information can go into a CV. So I mentioned sort of having potential additions in your document. One thing I think is helpful is that you could have all of this experience over a period of time, but I sort of mentioned before is that I mentioned how having a title in a document can be helpful because it allows you to draw the conclusion for the reader and then back it up with additional information instead of them drawing a conclusion and the inaccurate one. And most, I think 80 to 90% of CVs and resumes don't have a title. And a title means if you're applying for a specific position, it's the title of that role. If you're not applying for a specific position, it could be general areas of expertise, for instance. So it could be, the job could be market researcher, but if that's not the case, it could be market research, quantitative analysis, and branding. So you're giving, even if it's not a specific role, you're giving the audience context about what they're looking for. I am also an advocate for most documents now have some measure of executive summary. So not just the title, but thinking about the fact that if it's relevant and useful, is that you might add a few bullets about your background, of your experience and expertise that are related to the work that's being done. So this doesn't quantify, but if you have 8 years of specific experience in the area that they're looking for, you can quantify that for them so they don't have to do the math on the document. So, there's some combination and I talk about executive summaries, and we'll provide examples for all of these to all of you who've attended today, is that competencies, lists of things you can do. You could have highlights, which is accomplishments that made you want to feature higher in the document to prove experience and expertise. Sometimes skills get into this category, but the idea is that just know that there's an emerging trend across resumes and CVs is having an executive summary that makes it easy for somebody to understand what you're doing. and what you want. For those of you in the call that are thinking about, the clinical side of applications, if you're doing rotations, we have certain programs that do that. Sometimes you're listing where you've gotten your expertise. If you've done field work, if you've done clinical shadowing. Sometimes just listing the organization and their field work and what the topic was and the dates might be fine. Sometimes you want to illuminate. So again, there's ways to describe depending on what the nature of the work that's being done. And that CVs for clinical roles have their own nuances. And we are adept at talking to all of these specific roles depending on what you're looking for. And again, references, if asked for, is usually 3 to 5. And I mentioned, unless specifically asked for, keeping them off a resume, I think you don't necessarily have to add it unless specifically requested on a CV, unless it's very, very specific or a very traditional academic setting. So just a couple quick resources that can be helpful. Because I mentioned that there are technologies that are used by companies to filter application submissions. They use applicant tracking systems, which use, again, machine learning and AI to read and filter information. And based on if it meets a certain set of criteria, it gets filtered to a hiring manager or somebody that might reach out to bring you in for an interview. JobScan is an applicant tracking system emulator. So the exact same technology that organizations use to filter your application, this is the same tool to do it. And most of this tool is free. So what it allows you to do is take the content of your CV in one box, take the content of a position description if you're applying for a specific role in the other column. And what it does is with its tech backbone, it will evaluate and score your opportunity. And that is a great option. I would not specifically focus on the aggregate score of that analysis. There's some measure of arbitrary nature of it. What I would focus on, though, is the additional information that they're providing. There are best practices about layout and frameworks and word count that can be directional or guideposts as you're thinking about your document, so how things are typically done. But what I am a big advocate for is that it does keyword frequency analysis. So what it's doing is saying, how many times does a word show up in a position description, and how many times does it show up in your document? And is it relevant? What we're trying to do is, make sure you're not missing a core skill or competency they're asking for by not, using their vocabulary, or overusing a vocabulary, something that may be important, but maybe not as important. This is a good technological gut check, so you don't have to just do it with your own eyes. Because for those of you who are building documents like that, they take a lot of time. And they take a lot of mental energy, and it's really hard to be objective and then have an editorial eye on all this information. This is a nice way to supplement that. There's also a tool called VMock, which is another tool that allows you to upload a resume /CV, and it will look at 3 to 4 different parameters and give you feedback on format and content and messaging. And will oftentimes give you specific feedback on how to craft, a segment or a bullet. Most of the functionality in both of these things are free. There is value add, I think, particularly in JobScan for the premium version, because it also allows you to do the same level of work on your LinkedIn profile and other social media platforms. So we don't have site licenses for either of these tools, and there are other ones as well, but just knowing that they exist, and you may want to consider using them moving forward. So, in conclusion, as we're thinking about, steps to prepare your CV, and I mentioned cover letter, which is also, we're not talking in this particular conversation, but it's true, is that capture all the information first. Don't let your content dictate the document, not your idea of length and structure. You can always pare it down to get it to what it needs to be. For those of you who are applying for opportunities, have targets in mind, because if you're not customizing your document to audiences, it is more likely that somebody who will get past those gatekeepers. So being able to tell that story and being able to focus on what you're looking for is very helpful. I would have multiple people look at your documents before you submit them. So again, it could be friends, colleagues, people who know what you do, people who don't. They're going to be looking at that document a different way and maybe able to give you feedback in that area. Be patient. Is that, again, this is a skill and it's an iterative process. So there are times when you might want really quick turnover in a document. You might be speaking to somebody. We can help with quick turnovers, but typically, as you're thinking about, applications for maybe, spring and summer work, there's still time to develop these documents and, build a strategy for search. So I think it's using all the tools and the people at your disposal to help at your disposal to help you craft a marketing and branding document that separates you from your peers, gets you a conversation, so you have the opportunity to communicate your value in person or virtually to secure the jobs that you want. So as a career services offering for Tufts, we are in Dowling Hall. We are almost exclusively remote when it comes to programming and one-on-one coaching. There are some caveats. There are 3 of us that support. I support Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the School of Engineering, and SMFA. Robin Kahn, who is our Associate Director of Engineering Career Services, focusing on engineering for undergraduates and graduate students, is a great resource. And Ryan Smith, who is directs our career management support and services for the SMFA, is a great resource for those tools. And he also runs the career community around arts communication and marketing. So for those of you who might be interested in roles like that, he may be a great resource for you. And then below, we have an updated website. There are going to be a number of samples at the end of this presentation, or after that, maybe we'll to show you that aren't necessarily present on our Tufts Career Center webpage, but they will be distributed to everybody who registered for this event today.